Okay, hello, hello. How's everybody doing? Almost spring break? That's true. So tonight, before midnight, your outlines for your presentation with the 5 literature minimum, sources cited, and like a good idea of what the structure of your presentation is going to be. Due on Moodle. You can email me if you'd like, but well, you can email me if you like. Due tonight at midnight. And again, this is part of the points. The initial idea was not, but this is now part of the points of that presentation. So please do get that in tonight by midnight. And then we have spring break. Lab, when we come back from spring break, is of course on. There's going to be some other guest presenters, some graduate students working in vertebrate anatomy, talking to you guys about some of their research. And then on Tuesday, so our next lecture meeting after spring break is exam 2. So exam 2 is going to be very much focused on senses, diet, reproduction, locomotion. This last part of class, you're not going to be asked to like define, you know, homology like you might have been asked on the first exam, but like I do expect that you'll be able to like look at a phylogeny and maybe make a simple one based on the relationships you do know. So some of that material from exam 1 will come back, but again, the focus is going to be a lot on locomotion and reproduction, diet, senses, sort of these suites of anatomical adaptations different organisms have to accomplish different parts of like being alive. Any questions about that kind of stuff? Okay, so let's get into our second lecture on locomotion. We talked a lot about swimming, and we started to get to land locomotion. One of the really, really big and beautiful things I wanted you guys to take away was how once we have an evolutionary understanding of life, instead of zooming in on like the details of every single living species, we can pull out these really broad trends that help us really understand the constraints and the forces that are acting on organisms at all times. So if we're talking about something like locomotion, animals evolved in the oceans, vertebrates evolved in the oceans. There's this rigid notochord that's the ancestral condition. It becomes your vertebral column. Muscles on the lateral sides, either side, can pull against that cord and create a little bit of propulsion. Some of the earliest vertebrates we know about, earliest chordates we know about, have this little post-anal tail, a little bit of a fin, a little more surface area for propelling themselves through the water. They flex side to side. That ancient way of moving through water is inherited through all these fish groups we've talked about. They're all going like this. They all have fancy tail fins. They all might use other different pieces of their anatomy to move. Those are all interesting in their own rights. But that big, deep pattern is really there. And so if we add tetrapods to this tree, things get interesting. But even amongst tetrapods, how we left it on Tuesday was many of these bigger groups of tetrapods you guys know today, maybe they're not using fins and just their tail, but they're still undulating side to side, and they're maybe using their limbs as part of their locomotory structure. They're reaching, they're grabbing, they're pulling maybe with their limbs. But so many of these groups, the way an alligator crosses a golf course, the way a snake slithers across your driveway, that movement goes all the way back. And that to me is really beautiful and really, really cool. And so where we left it on Friday was talking about the animals that you guys know, the tetrapods, that are sitting here doing things when they locomote that aren't that obvious, lateral undulation with a bunch of asterisks on it, depending on what kind of organism it really is. So there's these 4 big clades, I'm being pretty simplistic here, of totally different ways of locomoting. So instead of using your vertebral column and side-to-side movement, you're doing something else. So you guys saw at the end of class, frogs, turtles, therian mammals, and birds, which are not using their vertebrae and their tails. They're not going side to side. I like watching that Impala very much. It's really intense. All right, so let's talk about it. Anurans, frogs, these are all limb-driven organisms. Their locomotion is driven by their limbs. They might be swimming, they might be climbing, they might be hopping, they might be walking, they might be burrowing. But they are not flexing their vertebrae. You guys have seen frog skeletons. There's a giant head, and then like a very short neck and back, and then a humongous but rigid pelvis. So there's no undulation in a frog. When they're tadpoles, of course, they're swimming. There's lateral undulation when they're babies. But by the time they metamorphose into their adult forms, they are a hopping, climbing, burrowing, doesn't matter, limb-driven, rigid-backed group of organisms. Here's that frog skeleton you guys have seen from class. And so in the case of frogs, like I kind of said earlier, I think what's really interesting is we can take the ones that aren't doing some version of the ancestral thing and then find their evolutionary story. And so of course, throughout frog evolution, the earliest frogs we have are probably laterally undulating. Their backs are really long and their feet aren't too big yet. It's really cool that we can see the evolution of this pretty extreme and immediately recognizable to you guys body plan. So not doing that ancestral thing, doing their own hopping or climbing or burrowing kind of thing. Mammals is one I actually want to spend a little bit of time on. Mammals, as you guys well know, are a kind of amniote. Many of the amniotes you can think of, the squamates, the rhynchocephalians, the crocodiles, they're doing the thing, lateral undulation with some limbs. And so some of the earliest animals like this one, that are actually related to mammals. This is a 300-million-year-old animal that's on our side of the tree. It's closer to us than it is to any living reptile, but of course it looks pretty reptilian, right? The ancestral amniotes are doing that kind of movement. And throughout the fossil record, we can actually see how through mammal evolution, there's this drawing in of the limbs. The limbs are more under your body rather than sprawling, and a regionalization of the backbone. It's only in this part of the vertebrate family tree that we get these segments of vertebrae that we call thoracic and lumbar. We get different structures. There's obviously different selective advantages that have to do with breathing, eating, metabolism, like the diaphragm is part of that. But when the legs are coming up underneath, you have more mobility in the skeleton. By the time we get to the living mammals, there's a lot of this up-down movement instead of side-to-side movement. Now, when I showed you that slide earlier, I said therian mammals do something different because platypuses and echidnas are still just like gators or lizards. They're laterally undulating and using their limbs. So it's not just, you can't just say mammals have something special, only some mammals do. That running platypus, which you don't see platypuses running very much, that's moving just like a lizard or a gator would move. And that's because it's inheriting the same locomotor adaptations, locomotor anatomy, basic stuff. Yes, it has fur. Yes, it has milk. Yes, it has 3 inner ear bones. It doesn't have teeth, but that's its own problem. But it's still going side to side, laterally undulating with its limbs. So some living mammals still do that. Most don't. Most living mammals are therians. So either marsupials or placental mammals. And somewhere in that line of mammal evolution, the transition was fully made to the limbs being under the body and the movement, especially during running, being more of a dorsoventral undulation. And so this skunk, which again, you don't usually see skunks running, its legs are way up there, its feet are way back here, it's really in a mid-stride. And so it's really only those mammals that are going like this. And so I want you guys to think back to those whales. You put a therian mammal in the water for the rest of its life, like a manatee or a dolphin or a whale, and they're got a big tail fin that they've evolved independently in manatees, independently in whales, but their locomotion is still like this, and their backs. So therian mammals not doing, it's limb driven, but also back driven, and that back driving is up and down. Frogs was just limbs, no spinal cord stuff really. Turtles are, of course, their own special case. I think it's pretty clear that turtles don't really undulate at all when it comes to their back. They've got pretty fancy necks because their backs are so rigid. They do a lot of reaching with their necks. They do a lot of reaching with their limbs. But as you guys know, the turtle carapace is quite literally, it's not like a shell on the outside of the animal, right? You guys know this now. The turtle shell is the backbone and ribs fused into a giant super structure that is completely inflexible. It's part of their anatomy to have their torso be completely rigid. So of course, there's no undulation at all. There's only limb-driven locomotion in turtles. So if you're a turtle, you might have reduced your hand into big flippers and you're a sea turtle. You might be a burrowing turtle that can make a big hole in the ground like some tortoises. You might have these big webbed feet for swimming through lakes and ponds. But still, all your locomotion is being driven by your limbs. There is no longer a back part to a turtle. No flexion dorsoventrally, no flexion side to side. So these are these like kind of obvious things, but I really like couching them. Because then you might have questions. Well, how did the turtle shell evolve? What did that look like? What does it look like when a turtle only has some of its shell? Fossils, we can get at that kind of stuff, but it's really fun to see that. Lastly, we'll talk about these animals. These are birds. Birds have a lot of difference. There is almost no undulation of the backbone in birds. And by the backbone, I mean the actual part of their body that's like part of their vertebral column that's constrained to like their shoulders to their hips. It's all limb driven. Birds have completely put their legs underneath their bodies. Dinosaurs are the actual animals that did that, and birds are just a kind of dinosaur. So all the dinosaurs have, instead of those legs sprawled out to the side, like in a platypus, like in an alligator, like in a lizard, the legs are drawn up under the body. They're under you, just like in mammals. So it's convergently involved like mammals have. And so that Tyrannosaurus Rex up there has these like hinge joints. There's not side to side movement at the ankle, at the knee, at the hip. It's all underneath and front to back. That toucan, those rayas, those guinea fowl all have inherited from a dinosaurian ancestor that same set of legs that are under the body instead of sprawled out to the side. And then, of course, you guys know that there's a very, very, very small amount of the bird's body length is its back. And that back is actually very rigid in almost all cases. The neck can be very long and flexible. The limbs can be very long and be doing all kinds of interesting things, but the back itself is very short and rigid. There's no undulation. So birds are completely, just like turtles, but in a totally different way. Birds are completely limb-driven. Frogs are almost completely limb-driven. Turtles are completely limb-driven. Mammals do undulation, but it's top to bottom instead of side to side. So there's these big, like, overarching patterns we can see. So next time you guys like at a pond, and if there's like a muskrat and a duck and a turtle, you'll be like, wow, look at all that. And then you can see a fish. That'll be cool, right? Pull all that stuff out. A couple other things about locomotion on land that I like. This slide's kind of floating on its own, but it's just something I always want to touch on, is the different ways we talk about animal locomotion. So these are all 3 different mammals. These are their mammally skeletons. And I want to talk about foot anatomy and stance because I think it's just something that's really important. It's something you guys can see really easily. So all these mammals have a homologous skeleton. They have all the exact same bones. And of course, the adaptations of their body mean that those bones are adapted to be different shapes to do different things. So these terminal phalanges, we call them unguals. These phalanges, metatarsals, tarsals, tib, fib, and then femur are all here. But in the horse, it looks like this, and in the human, it looks like this, and in the fox, it looks like that. Go ahead and talk to your neighbors for a second about the feet of these 3 different mammals. I'll take any kind of observations, but just make it clear with each other what's happening. Yeah. No, I got almost blocked. All right, so what can we talk about here? What are we seeing here?
All of them have different parts of their anatomy that make contact with the ground.
Yeah, that's like the really important thing here. The stance of these animals is completely different depending on the bony structure of their foot. So we are humans, we make the words up. The word foot only exists for our species because we decided it was a word. And not even all of our species, right? The English-speaking people in our species say the word foot, we made it up. And when we say foot, we usually mean this whole thing. And so a horse's foot, I know you all want it to be the hoof. But biologically, the horse's foot is that too. This is the horse's foot. Do you like that? Are you like, no, I mean foot, and I mean this part. Okay, but the bones of your foot are homologous to this bone in the horse, and these bones in the fox. You have your tarsal bones, your actual ankle bones, your metatarsals, your toes, and the very tips of your toes, which are technically a little different, all touching the ground. That fox is only walking on its toes. You can barely do that. Ballerinas can kind of do that. When you walk on your toes, you're still putting the ends of the purple bones, the metatarsals, on the ground. When I do this and I'm tiptoeing, I'm still putting more than the fox is just casually. It's just its toes, meaning like the loose parts, not its metatarsals. You have to put at least a little bit of metatarsal and then your toes to even tiptoe. Ballerinas can do the crazy thing where they go up on like just their toes. A horse isn't walking on its toes. A horse is walking vertically on the very, very tip of one single bone. That's true for almost all hoofed animals. Maybe they have 2 hooves on the ground, maybe they have 1 like a horse, but still they're walking on the very tip of 1 bone, which is extremely different from you with your like 50 bones all touching the ground. It's not 50, but you know it's a lot. So we have different words for this. A human structure, a human foot is plantigrade. There's not a lot of plantigrade mammals. Bears are kind of plantigrade. And plantigrade means from your tarsals all the way to your terminal phalanges, or we might say your unguals. These bones all touch the ground. A fox is digitigrade. A lot of mammals are digitigrade. And then that horse there is unguligrade, which means it's walking on the ungual, the very, very tip bone. Just that 1 bone carries all the weight of the leg. And so, of course, what I think is cool is that the homology exists not just for bones, but for all the other structures too. Your Achilles tendon comes down from your femur and attaches to your calcaneum, one of your heel bones. You have your Achilles tendon. So does a fox, so does a horse. And so you can see it on all these animals really easily. And so a horse's knee is way up here, and that's its ankle. It's still the same bones. And so this is all within mammals, so it's kind of easy to understand. But I always like to make the point that this same actual structures are all pretty much present in other animals too, including all amniotes. So people always say birds have backwards knees. Birds do not have backwards knees. A flamingo does not have a backwards knee. A flamingo has a foot that goes up to here. This is a pigeon. Here's the foot. All the way up to here counts as what you would call the foot. These are its metatarsals, and then there's tarsal bone. So a lot of birds have a completely normal knee between the tibia and their femur, but it's like up in their feathers, so you don't see it very often. But a bird does not have a backwards knee. It's just got a much fancier foot than you have. I actually would argue that the human foot's the fancy one. It just looks so stubby that it's not easy to call it fancy. Does that make sense? You can be the annoying person in your group. People are like, look at that flamingo at the zoo. You can be like, that's not its knee, you know, it's the ankle. I want to talk now about convergence and ways animals get around together. So these are completely different animals. A lizard, hilariously called a sandfish, which isn't helpful. A tortoise, and then 3 completely different mammals: an Afrotherian mammal, a marsupial mammal, and a Laurasiatherian mammal that have all evolved to go underground. So what we can notice about things like this is that evolution will craft again and again and again through adaptation to specific environments, specific behaviors, really similar body plans. So sweets, a bunch of them all together, like when we talked about anteating and diet, sweets of locomotor characters, and then fossorial means digging, burrowing animals. So I want you guys, we're going to do a few of these. Talk to your neighbors for a second. What do you see? What do you notice? What are these suites of characters that unite digging or fossorial locomoting animals?
Right.
Not small overall. Okay.
All right, what are some features we can notice uniting these different burrowing, digging animals? Back turned arms, kind of like this. What else?
They're all kind of like big paddles to their arms.
Big paddles to the arms, pretty strong arms. They're very well muscled arms. I know you can't really tell, but like a mole's humerus is hilarious. It's like wider than it is long. That makes sense. Like the little ends of it are like this, and then it's like that big because it's jacked. It's got huge muscles because it has to physically move the earth around. What else?
A lot of them have reduced eyes.
Yeah, reduced eyes or protected eyes. Some of them have lost their eyes completely because they're burrowing all the time. They do different kinds of things. These are all sort of like only loosely doing the same things. I want to make it clear too. Things like the moles are like in dirt, burrowing holes where they have to be all the time. Their face is shovel shaped. That's one thing you might notice, kind of this spade shaped face that some of these really intense burrowers have. Their face is doing some of the work of burrowing. But this tortoise is like other tortoises, but it's got like a rather low shell. It doesn't have a big dome. It's got really very big forearms with very big claws for burrowing, but it really only burrows in like loose sand. It's never like disappearing like Bugs Bunny or a cartoon mole into the dirt. The tortoise is digging, but it's not quite doing what these animals are doing. The sandfish is called the sandfish because it looks like a fish, and it only also is in deserts with very dry sand, like in the Sahara, in the Kalahari. It'll disappear into the sand and go and pop up somewhere else. So it's called the sandfish because it looks like it's swimming through the sand. And it's not burrowing with big, powerful arms. It's a very sleek, smooth animal that just like moves through the sand. It pushes its body against the sand. That's a very different way of burrowing, but it still has the shovely face that a lot of the moles have all convergently evolved. The moles have the big forelimbs for pushing dirt around like the tortoise kind of has. I agree with you. They all have pretty reduced sensory structures, especially eyes. Eyes are not going to be particularly helpful underground, and really probably more importantly, they're really likely to be injured or infected or smashed or something like that if you're always underground. So these animals who aren't always underground still have eyes, because eyes are of course important and helpful. But if you're truly committing to underground, you might lose sight. I wanted to show you this because I think it's great. This is a golden mole disappearing after being let loose from being tagged. Bye. So there's no tunnel there, right? It's just sand. It's the closest I could find to like Bugs Bunny fake burrowing, but it's real, which is what's really cool. All right, let's do another one of these. These are all arboreal animals, extremely different animals. List amphibians, amniotes, mammals, reptiles. These are all arboreal, tree climbing animals. How would you describe the locomotor adaptations that you can see evolving in animals that live in trees and bushes up off the ground for almost their whole life? Okay, talk about this one for a while.
They have used this.
All right, what are some features you guys are noticing in arboreal animals?
We talked about kind of like, not like grasping, but flexible digits, kind of at least like kind of grab stuff.
Grabby digits, flexible digits. I'll also accept long digits, like relatively long individual digits. It's cool, right? I mean, maybe I'm too much of a nerd about it, but like, that's still a frog, it's still a lizard, it's still a rodent, it's still a primate, just like anyone that lives in a desert of all kinds of those same animals. But because it's arboreal, they all have, longer fingers than you might expect in other members of the same group. What else?
A lot of them. They're trees.
There's
Logistics.
some camouflage happening for sure. Savannah, you want to say something? No. All right, so locomotion wise, long fingers, You're totally right, of course, about camouflage.
Their eye.
What about their eyes?
Bigger than the face shape, and they're all close.
So there, I bet you, I mean, here's a sloth, right? That little face. The squirrel's a little bit more, I bet I don't know the answer to this, but I bet you there is some level of binocular vision that's more evolved in most arboreal animals, because a depth perception, knowing how far that branch is away in front of you, is gonna be a really, really, really big thing. I bet you're right about that. It's certainly true in a lot of the mammals, and it looks like it's true for that frog, right? Those are pretty relatively forward-facing eyeballs. What else?
I would say in at least two of these ones, some form of webbing to like glide while you're jumping. So the tree frog and the squirrel has some webbing under the arm.
You mean like an ability to kind of just like
Just
catch some
play
stuff?
out.
That's interesting. So that's, yeah, I wasn't thinking about something like that at all. We're of course gonna talk about that kind of thing. What about other, you guys said long fingers. What else is long? Their toes for sure, but also just their limbs. Like they just have long, reachy limbs, long arms, long legs. They have different adaptations, right? The tarsiers got really sensitive finger pads. The tree frog has actual little suction cups on its fingertips. The sloth has just like rigid hooks as claws that it can just use to like passively hang, like a hanger in your closet as it's moving through branches. So there's little adaptations to all the fingertips for sure, but the arms, like the arms and legs of this lizard compared to other iguana things, which is what it's related to, are relatively longer because it's like in trees and branches. That's a thing. Long arms, long legs, grippy hands, maybe something related to vision. Little special adaptations. That squirrel's got great claws. You guys have all seen a squirrel run up a tree. The claws there are like very intense compared to like a prairie dog, which is another kind of squirrel, cannot run up a tree. So like there's little adaptations in the fingertips for sure. Each one of these has a GIF. I love this one very much. Here's a gibbon at a zoo. So we call that kind of locomoting brachiating, like with your arms. So gibbons brachiate when they get around. That structure looks like it's taken a beating. But again, think about limb length relative to other members of the same clade. So think about chimpanzees, gorillas, you. This is an ape like us. Really long arms, really long hands, really long fingers, grasping tips, but a tree specialist. And so there it is, living a tree life. A lot of musculature that goes with that kind of movement too, that like the sloth for sure doesn't have because it's passively hanging and not moving fast. But that elongation of the arms, that's really something. All right, let's do another one. Cursorial, so desert or grassland animals, open habitat animals, usually can be pretty fast and do all kinds of other stuff. So I want to know not about how fast they might be, but I want to know about the anatomy that you guys can see. What is the anatomy that these birds and mammals, so of course they're not inheriting it from a common ancestor. What are the anatomies that you can see of these birds and mammals for being running open habitat animals? This, by the way, is a rodent. So it's a cat and a dog and a artiodactyl, a parasadactyl, two birds and a rodent living in open habitats. See. All right, what are some locomotor characters related to cursoriality? Open habitat, running usually.
They don't have a lot of like muscle mass, like in their tib fib areas, like it's a lot more up in their femurs.
Oh my gosh, that's a huge one. Muscles are bunched up at the body wall, the body cavity, the actual center of mass is where all the muscles really are. And then the other corresponding part of that, what's another thing about these legs?
Some intense tendons.
Got some intense tendons. So tendons are taking that muscular strength that's now, you know, bunched up near the top and transmitting it down. What I would say, greatly elongated distal limb elements. So it could be the forearm and the hand, it could be the shin and the foot, but the femur and the humerus, relatively small, but really that's where all the muscles are. And then the translation of that energy down these long rods that they all have. So of course, the bird femur and the zebra femur are ultimately homologous, but the adaptations of like having the muscles built around them with those really long distal limb elements, that's convergently evolved so that zebra and that ostrich who are running from the same lion are both getting fast in the same way, but they evolved it independently. It's okay. Anything else?
Very little contact with.
When you get moving, yeah. So yeah, we can, that's what kind of cursorial is a little bit of a cheat on my part because it really means running and I'm talking about open habitats. You don't have to be in open habitats. But yeah, usually that means being cursorial means at one point in your locomotor stride, your gait, you are airborne. So all these animals are airborne at some point while they're moving. So that dog in just a second is gonna be in the air. Actually, I don't know if any, I guess the roadrunner's in the air, this picture. Oh, and the antelope almost is. The cheetah might be. So an airborne part of your stride. So it's like a reason elephants, you might hear this, elephants can't run. They can move really fast and they can flip your car over, but technically there's always 1 foot on the ground if you're an elephant, just because that's a body size thing. Another thing you guys didn't say, and I forgot to say back to you, is that almost all arboreal animals have a pretty hard size limit. You don't get past a certain size. Arboreal animals tend to be smaller. So cursorial animals having that kind of a leave from the ground. Here's another fun gif of another cursorial animal. Even that animal is leaving the ground at some point. Relatively massive compared to the others, but still the same sort of like muscle bunching at the top, relatively elongated distal limb elements. But for the rhino, that's really stretching it because it's such a huge animal that can run and truly leave the ground as it's running. But it's pretty fast when it needs to be. All right, one more. These are all saltatorial animals. They're all mammals, which means they jump or they hop to locomote. They locomote by hopping. Saltation is like jumping. These all have independently evolved this body plan. They've all independently evolved this method of getting around. None of them have a common ancestor with any of the other ones on this slide. That was a hopper that they both inherited it from. They've all done it on their own. So that's an amazing test case of like evolution. So if you have a mammal skeleton and you want to hop, how are you going to end up building that? Well, you guys talk about it.
So they have this doing on the extended this well, so they're like on the back. They all have like very little. Like kids for us.
All right, what really just jumps out to you right away about saltatory or jumping, hopping vertebrate mammals, really?
That's a big back legs.
Big back legs? What parts of these back legs are big? Huge feet. that is your foot, right? Here's the calcaneum with the Achilles tendon attached to it. So there's the kangaroo foot, here's the elephant shrew foot, the jerboa foot, the spring hare foot, which is an African rodent, right? Big feet that they can put weight on, that they do put weight on. That kangaroo is just standing like you would stand with its full foot on the ground, but it looks ridiculous on the kangaroo rat. And then, right, relatively long shins, again, similar to the runners, bunched muscles up at the top. Other things?
Why are their ears so like relatively big to their teeth?
That's interesting, right? So that probably isn't really anything to do with locomotion, but a lot of these animals are open habitat, grassland desert animals. And so they are shorter than the plants all around them that are pretty dense. So sound is their way of knowing who's in the area. They can't see over the grass like the zebra can. That's an idea. Anything else with these animals? Yeah, there's a lot of bipedality amongst hoppers. The rabbits don't have such crazy legs, but the rabbits are always on all fours. Whereas the jerboas, the spring hares, the kangaroo rats, and the kangaroos are almost always on 2 feet. They can go like this sometimes when they're just moving around. They walk on all fours. But for the most part, they're bipedal. There's a lot of bipedality happening amongst hoppers, which is really fun. Yeah, reduced hands in a lot of them, or reduced arms, I guess I would say, in a lot of them that are kind of bipedal. There's plenty of other saltatory animals though. Frogs, you can also see the giant feet and the big powerful legs with muscle sponge to the top. Anurans are saltators, a lot of them. Some of them are not, like toads and tree frogs, but a lot of them are. And then of course, there's some birds already bipedal that have evolved the ability to hop. You guys can think of like lots of songbirds, how they get around. Just out here on the quad, you can watch a songbird kind of go like this, but this is more fun. So plenty of penguins, including this one genus of macaroni and rockhopper penguins, famously actually hops to go everywhere. So that's a swimming bird, but you know, when they're on land, they can do fun things. Not really the same level of adaptation as you see in the mammals and the frogs, but still saltating. All right, 2 fun things I just want to say because I can't resist. These are kind of cheap and stupid because these animals both walk and burrow and do normal things. But these are 2 examples of vertebrates that do a little bit of rolling, like Sonic the Hedgehog style, in their lifestyle. So pangolins can roll up into balls like this. And there are cases of pangolins, like when there's an incline, they don't necessarily search for it, but when there's an incline, they're getting away from something, they'll roll up and then just like roll down a hill, which is really funny because they're just a little pine cone. The best example though is easily the pebble toad. So the pebble toad is a South American frog. This is not a hopping frog. It is extremely small, has extremely short little stubby legs. But pebble toads are great because when they're crawling around in their habitat, if a spider or a scorpion or another frog or whatever is like coming their way, they're on extreme montane environments, like the north part of the Andes and in these highlands in Venezuela. It's kind of like where Up took place, on one of those big table mountains in Venezuela. On the side of those things is where the pebble toad lives. And they're so small that they don't get hurt by like gravity and falling. So what they'll do is just pull it all in and fall. That's how they'll get away. So here's an awful gift of a pebble toad. It saw a spider and it just curled up its arms and legs and let itself go. You obviously have to be a certain minimal or certain maximum body size for this to not be lethal the way to locomote, but it's hardly locomotion either. But it's a great transition into what we're about to talk about next, which is flying. Okay. Oh, wait, before we talk about flying, I forgot about this slide. I love snakes, you guys. Snakes are hilarious and amazing. So snakes are just tubes. And so they don't really have a place to be talked about, everything else besides the lateral undulating that they do. But I can't resist not showing you how snakes are just muscle tubes. And you guys saw in lab how free they are from their skin and how mobile they have different parts of their body. I just like to show you the different ways snakes get around. So this is the classic snake locomotion. It is lateral undulation, but we call it serpentine. Not really hard, right? It's how a snake moves. It's when you're just pushing parts of your body off the ground. General kind of S shape. All snakes can do a serpentine. It's just how they get around. They're searching, looking for prey, moving through their environment, not really that big a deal. There's another kind of movement called concertina. This is when they get going fast and they have rings of their body that of course are moving. So it's like the ring stays in one spot, but the actual snake's body is traveling through that spot. where they're arcing their bodies off the ground instead of just like slithering. There's like a air gap between. They're going up, up, up as they move through ground. That's concertina movement. So if you scare a snake, you're going to see some concertina. If you don't scare a snake and you just see it, you might see some serpentine. But then really, here's the fun ones. Rectilinear, I'll let you take that in.
Really good with the patterns on it too.
Oh, it looks like, yeah, it looks like high fashion on that up adder, right? So that's just using its belly scales to like grab the ground and move forward. It's almost like a millipede, but using belly scales.
That's not a primary one.
That snake absolutely does the other two most of the time. Rectilinear is one of the ways they sneak up on stuff. Because they blend in with the forest floor, all the leaf pattern, and so they'll like move forward. But how do you move forward if you don't have any legs and you always have to go like this? Well, some snakes can do rectilinear locomotion, which I mean, how do I not at least show you that? That's called rectilinear motion. Another super cool snake one is sidewinding. Usually happens in deserts. You guys probably all heard of sidewinders. These are little vipers usually that can do this. And so if you see the head is up there. And so the tracks are being made head to tail, but in that direction. So the sand's really hot, and this is a very efficient way to move across only certain substrates. Dry sand you can move like this on because the sand will give away to you. It wouldn't really work on like other soils and things like that. But desert snakes do this thing sidewinding, where like, believe it or not, that is a very efficient movement. Also just amazing to watch. And also it's fun to imagine like finding those tracks and being like, I don't understand. Sidewinding. And then the other thing I just like to make clear is that like snakes can do everything everybody else can do. And so you saw all those arboreal animals that have, you know, long arms and long legs and long fingers and long toes. Snakes are very good in trees and they do not have anything to do that with other than their tubes. So when I say tubes with no limits, I'm thinking about this GIF of a python climbing a tree. Yeah, it's a real Jungle Book vibe for sure. If only they had actually hypnotic eyeballs. But how do you, a meat tube, would climb a palm tree which has no structure on it at all? Well, you just squeeze the tree and get up there. I have to imagine that there's an iguana or a monkey or something that's just like, come on, like at the top of that tree. Because what are you gonna do now? Anyway, snakes are great, and they don't really follow the rules anybody else follows because they don't have two legs or arms. Anyway, I had to show you some snake locomotion because it's too much fun. All right, now let's talk about flying. We got whatever we have, half an hour maybe. Yeah, about half an hour to talk about flying. So we talked about swimming, we talked about terrestrial locomotion. Now we're going to talk about flight. Flying is really hard to do. Flying is really hard to do. It is a rare thing on this planet, and this planet has a lot of life on it. So I want you to talk to your neighbors for a minute, really get into this. If you want to be locomoting up here and you're an animal, what are traits that are going to unite you with other flyers? And there's a whole lot, so I want you to really put some time into this. Come up with 5 things you're expecting anatomical adaptations flyers to have. Okay, go ahead.
I want to know what
All right, what are some traits? For you guys are talking about 5 different things, at least we could think of. Okay, I'm gonna say airfoils, things to get out there and actually swim through the air. Have them be a structure that might be way you could describe it as big enough, but the surface area interacts in the right way to give you some kind of like lift in air, for sure. That's a pretty obvious one. What else?
Do you make adaptations, like in your lungs for the pressure of the air?
Oh, if you go up really high. Sure, so there might be specializations for high altitude, for sure. A lot of animals that can fly don't go high altitude, like there's like owls. Most owls are like, they're never above 300 feet above the ground. They don't like to go up there. So you're right, of course. For general, just for flyers, what else?
Generally, they have an aerodynamic body plan.
Okay, aerodynamic bodies. What else?
Specialized bones.
What does that mean?
So I mean, there's like pneumatic bones, like hollow bones that have like.
So-
insects in them.
So birds are a specific example, and probably a pretty famous example of flying animals, and they do have pneumatic bones, but what you're really talking about is like their,
Like they're fibula or like fused bones. I don't know.
these are birdie specific things that you're totally right about. I'm gonna say like a pretty light skeleton. If you're a vertebrate, you might not be a vertebrate and fly. But if you're a flying animal with a vertebrate, your skeleton could be relatively light. Your whole body weight. I'm just gonna say mass, actually. Reduced mass in some ways. You could be a big flyer, but like compared to land or ocean animals, you're never gonna be tremendously huge. So birds, everything you were talking about, Wells, of course, like how birds do it, but other flying animals might do it different ways. What else? Yeah, okay.
You said like, smaller in comparison, like proportionally torso compared to the limbs and.
Oh, so how come? That's like a very zoomed in one that I really like that, but yeah.
I think most of it probably is the mass reduction kind of thing. Because the wings can only carry so much.
Well, all your guts and fat are gonna be, and you have generally a lighter body mass, maybe your skeleton's lighter, these are very much related. And so, yeah, usually your torso isn't the thing doing any of the airfoil. You're not getting your lift from your torso, usually, but there's some interesting examples of that, but okay. What other things? Yeah.
So based off the vision, there's like huge chest.
So, yeah, okay, so, and this is true for all flyers, I'll say. The pigeon has the chest muscle, the powerful muscles for, for powering flight, is what I'll say. Even like a grasshopper's got huge muscles inside its exoskeleton to move its like wings. There's 5, anything else? So these are all you can imagine general things. These are all rules that airplanes are gonna have too. Right, helicopters are gonna have versions of this. Anything humans invent that flies is gonna have a version of this. And then we can try to figure out how animals, differently potentially, have adapted their bodies to fit these general parameters, which is really cool. I wanna make the point to you guys that flying is super, super, super rare. Flying is super, super, super rare. Traveling in the air on this planet is much less rare. And so I wanna start off with the gliders and the parachuters before we get into the actual powered flyers. And so, of course, I have to show you guys the fishes that fly. So there are a lot of fishes. These are 2 ocean-going fishes, the half-beak and the flying fishes. Flying fish is the most famous. And then here's some freshwater fishes. This one's in Africa, this one's in South America, that escape their predators. All of these are actually doing that, escaping their predators by leaving the water. And then they have greatly extended, usually, pectoral fins that do function as airfoils. And they're relatively hydrodynamic bodies are also aerodynamic bodies. And so flying fish can like get away from a predator and then fly for like 200 feet, touch the water for a second, jump out again, fly for another 200 feet. So these are gliders, these are not flyers. When we talk about flying, we mean powered flight, like you lift yourself up into the atmosphere. These are gliding animals, but they're gliding fishes. And I think it's cool for you guys to realize how many vertebrates have evolved the ability to at least travel through the air. And again, these are gliders. Plenty of Birds that used to fly, use their wings to fly underwater. There's a little distraction for you that we don't have to really spend too much time on. A lot of times in this planet's history, fossils that I'm not going to talk about, even though I want to, but living animals today have evolved gliding. And one place that gliding seems to evolve all the time is in complex vertical habitats. That sounds fancy, but you can think of it as forests. In forests where there's a lot of tall structures and it would take a lot of work to go like this, there's a lot of animals that have figured out how to get between treetops that are far away that have evolved gliding. And I guarantee you gliding has evolved more times than you realize. So there's different kinds of gliding on land. There's parachuting. Parachuting is when you jump off a tree or you jump away from the thing. Could be the rock wall, could be the cliff face, could be the tree. But you're falling at less than 45 degrees. So if this is the tree and here's 45 degrees from the tree, we call it parachuting if you go like this, and we call it gliding if you go like this. So like a 45-degree angle, if that makes sense, from the surface you're jumping off of. Lots of parachuting. Parachuting is pretty simple. A lot of these animals, like that sifaka, that's a boomafoo, for those of you who know what boomafoo is. That sifaka has like fur on its belly and on its legs and on its arms. This colobus monkey has a lot of extra fur and skin. And so when it jumps, it just has a little bit of resistance to the air and it can fall a little bit better than if it was just like totally falling like some other kind of monkey to get to the next tree. There's lizards. This gecko's got these toe pads. It's got skin stretched between its legs and its arms. That lizard has just like a flat body that it can make flatter when it jumps. They're all capable of parachuting. Parachuting is a real Buzz Lightyear situation. It's like falling with style. You're just falling, but you're doing it in a way that's like a little bit resistant to the air. Gliding has evolved a whole lot. So a glider is anything that jumps off the tree that it's on and beats that 45-degree angle. It has some kind of lift usually. It can like go where it wants to go after it jumps. It's not just falling with style. It can go somewhere. These are three completely independent evolutions of gliding amongst frogs. So these are flying frogs, gliding leaf frogs, fringe-lipped frogs. You can see that one just has really expanded pads on every single toe, kind of like you guys saw the coot or the grebe do for swimming feet in the water. Whereas there's full webbing like a duck or a pelican in these two other frogs. Not swimming with these, using them to have more surface area to glide through the forest. These are all frogs, usually nocturnal, jumping out of trees and gliding to the next tree. At least 3 times that has evolved in frogs. I think that's awesome. It's evolved a lot of times in squamates. I'll let you take a second to talk to each other about these gliding squamates. These are all photographs.
So say, it's like not a class. It's not like more of those notes get you in place.
How much do we love Lupersaurus here? Like, but so they all are using ribs. Draco is of course dragon. This lizard is very famous because that has like actual extensions off of its ribs. Like its body cavity is its normal body cavity, but there's actually extensions off the ribs that form these wing things that it can go with to make a big surface area. These geckos just have, again, increased surface area coming off their torsos, maybe a little bit off their legs. This one, more than that one. Paradise tree snakes, or as they're called, gliding snakes or flying snakes. These are Southeast Asian. You can see how they flatten their bodies and make this cup to let air pass, like a cup shape, to make air pass through them in such a way that they can actually do this in the air and get forward while they're falling. So these snakes can go hundreds and hundreds of feet. There's really awesome papers about these snakes. You guys can watch YouTube videos of these snakes where people like let one jump and they have it like on a runway in the jungle or something. So it's like very open and you just see the snake like, you know, for 200 feet until it hits the ground. So a gliding snake can get from tree to tree, just like a flying lizard can, a flying frog can. These are all, again, independent evolutions of gliding. A lot of them are doing this. They're making more of an airfoil. They're making more surface area to be resistant to their falling. Here's the snake, by the way. Sorry, I should have put this up. It's not beating 45 right then, that's for sure.
Yeah, I was about to say, that's the, like, it's pretty quick,
All right, what about mammals? Feather-tailed gliders, greater gliders, and flying phalangers. 3 completely independent from each other evolutions of gliding amongst marsupials. Anomalurs are rodents. Flying squirrels are squirrels, so a kind of rodent. And colugos are related to you guys, right? There's tree shrews, colugos, and primates are all in eukaryotic areas together. All 6 of these mammals are gliders, getting from tree to tree. They've all evolved it completely on their own. So they look similar, but if you look at the details, they're all different. Take a second, talk to each other about these gliding mammals and what you can tell about them.
They have them even like really quality, yes, something else, fresh out of the board.
All right, any observations about these guys?
Lots of extra skin.
Lots of extra skin. But don't you love how it's like generally the same pattern, but if you actually start to look, you're like, oh, but that attaches in a different place, but that one doesn't have that. All the patches of skin are called patagia. So they're all different patagiums between the neck and the wrist. The clugo is obviously the most extreme, like kite shape, all the way to the tip of the tail. The squirrels still have, you know, hey, I'm a squirrel, I have self-respect, I need my fluffy tail, but I still have a little bit of a connection. The clugo's got the patagium all the way to the tip of the tail. Also, these 2 squirrels have their hands. You see their hands, right? Both squirrels have one of their carpals, a wrist bone that is just turned into like a rod. And when they jump, they can be like, rump, and then put their arm out to here. The hand is right there, but the wing stretches to there because they just have a wrist bone that they can be like, make it bigger. The flying squirrel's got that too. Look where the little hand is, and then look where the actual tip of the patagium is. It's because it has a little wrist bone that can stick out. Or I guess this way. Fun, fun, fun. Also, greater gliders, one of these animals that like come up on Instagram every once in a while, and everybody loses their mind because they never heard of them before. They're like pretty cute. An Australian glider. All right. Those are gliders though. Parachuters and gliders. Something I want to make so clear to you, and I'll just say it without going into detail. In the fossil record, gliding evolves many other times amongst all kinds of different animals. So gliding is not hard to do. It's anything you can do to increase your surface area, and it's going to happen probably in forested environments. But flight, powered flight, flap or something, and you go up in the air. Talk to each other, please. How many individual times has powered flight evolved in the history of this planet, at least as far as we can tell? All right, how many times has powered flight evolved? How do you go up? You can go up, you control your altitude, you go up. All the gliders use gravity and ride it. That's what I mean.
So then let's see if we share with those. I don't. But I guess it's the street. And then you can say for.
All right, you guys don't have to like random guess a number. What are the times powered flight has evolved? That you can think of? Birds, for sure. Bats, for sure.
At least once, maybe more.
Yeah, interesting. We could talk about that. Pterodactyls. Anything else? I wanted to show you that like mammals have evolved gliding 6 times, 3 times in marsupials. Gliding is not hard. Geckos have evolved it. Just within geckos, gliding has evolved a bunch of times. 4 times is the number that we all use for powered flight evolving. It might be technically more than that because in certain clades, like insects and like early bird evolution, there might technically be a couple little different times, but those are the big times. Insects absolutely did it first. Insects are some of the first arthropods to really be successful on land, next to like spiders and millipedes. And within like only a few tens of millions of years after insects are on land, boom, some of them get wings. And wings are a common feature of not all, but almost all insect diversity. Any bugs you guys can think of, insects you can think of today that don't have wings, look closer or check and they've lost their wings. So even ants and termites, like they fly when they mate with each other, then they knock the wings off. So flying is an insect situation for sure. That's the first time flight ever evolved. Pterodactyls did it second. They're a kind of reptile that did it in the Triassic period. Dinosaurs did it third in the Jurassic. That's when birds evolved. Mammals did it last, about 55 million years ago in the Paleocene, when we get things like bats. So as far as we know, powered flight, moving your body through the air under your own power. Obviously, we have things like helicopters and airplanes that we build, but using your body to do so has evolved 4 times. And that might be the actual minimum. It might be like some silly, like technically it's 6, but 4 times. And these are those big clades. Something you'll note, I hope, is that flying animals, once flying evolves, it seems to be one of those things that leads to incredible speciation. Birds are easily, well, not easily anymore quite, but almost easily, you could say, the most abundant and speciose tetrapods on land. Bats are the second most diverse order of mammals. Insects are easily the most abundant animals on land. Flying is an interesting correlation with these things. So you can think about population, movement, genetics, migration, all kinds of stuff like that. Once you can fly, there's a lot of stuff that happens. All right, let's talk about flying. I said birds evolved flight 1 time. So one thing you guys can think about is bird evolution. So here's a bird phylogeny. Cool. Here's who can fly and who can't fly. So a question you might have is the common ancestor of all birds a flying animal or not a flying animal? And if it's not a flying animal, where does flying evolve in bird evolution? Okay, use this phylogeny, just talk to each other. And if you can't decide, you can think about this. But you can also use this phylogeny just to interpret and say where you think flying did evolve. Okay, go ahead.
I was not good. I want you.
You know, the.
All right, so just what would you guys put? Like if all you had was this slide, what are you gonna say for where you would hypothesize flight evolved? Before the swan. So what do you mean with the penguin then? If you say flight evolved here, what's the deal with the penguin? Independently lost the ability to fly, and then it's like, well, I still fly, I just use a different medium to fly. But yes, okay, maybe you can put that there, that's great. Anybody else with any other ideas where they would put it? Yeah, Brian.
480, because that's the, and then for those 3 characters, they independently like evolve the ability to not fly.
So you might look at like the musculature on a cassowary's wing and be like, this thing's got all these adaptations that other flying birds have, but it's just like reduced its wing, but it still has like these little muscle insertions. You might have all kinds of things you might wonder about these. The kiwi doesn't even have arms anymore, so it's kind of hard to know. But the cassowary, you might be able to say something. So what additional data would you need to sort this out? Fossils is a great one. You know, I love fossils. you can also do Evo Devo kind of stuff, right? You could like look at the developing embryos of those. And what's great, of course, is that we do have fossils. And all the early birds from dinosaur times fly. So this bird has teeth, this bird has teeth, this bird has teeth, and like still has a tail and claws on its wings and all kinds of crazy stuff. But all the early birds from like the Jurassic and the Cretaceous are all flying. That's one thing you could add to your tree and then be like, oh, and then does the cassowary and the kiwi become kind of like the penguin? We also have fossils of these birds, ancient relatives from after the extinction of the dinosaurs, and they all are flight capable. So you added that data and you're like, oh, okay. But for a long time, like if you go to like 1920, everyone thinks these birds are like flightless, maybe dinosaur things, just like dinosaurs were. But they went through an ancestral period where they're a common ancestor with everybody else, absolutely is flying. So independent loss of flying in the air, independent loss of flying in the air, maybe here and here. You guys don't know in this biology, and that's okay. But we can add things, we can add more information, which is really fun to get at these questions. Build the data, build our expectations. All right, now let's talk about comparative wings. All of these animals, the human, the bird, and the bat, we're not gonna talk about pterodactyls as much as I would like to, because this is comparative anatomy of living things, so I'm not gonna do pterodactyls. Here's a bat wing and a bird wing, and then they're kind of flipped on that side with a human, but these are all amniotes. All these bones are homologous. They still have phalanges, they still have metacarpals, they still have carpals, radius, ulna, humerus. It's all the same bones. So talk to each other for a second about a bird wing and a bat wing, if you want to, a human arm. What's the same, what's different, how is flying happening?
Light feathers, they use just very well that bone.
So what are some similarities? What are some differences between birds and bats when it comes to their wing structures?
Mostly like a difference in the metacarpals and
Metacarpals and the carpals. So the hand, you could say the hand. So how would you describe a bird hand versus a bat hand?
long fingers and big nails.
Birds are super reduced hands. It's really only digits 2 and 3 that you can even really see. Technically, there's other ones on here. We're going to talk about this digit later. But these are pretty reduced hands, but they still are homologous. They're still hands. Whereas a bat has a very, fun, familiar to you mammal 5-fingered hand with super long fingers on 5, 4, and 3. 2 is pretty long too. But the thumb of a bat is not that crazy. A bat thumb kind of looks like your thumb. Digit 1. But then these really long fingers. Okay, what else is similar or different between a bat and a bird?
We were talking about how the bat uses its skeleton to increase the surface area of its wing, while the bird uses feathers instead.
Yeah, the bird has an integumentary structure. Feathers are like structural. These are stiff feathers, but it's part of the skin. It's part of the integument of the bird. It's part of the outer covering. The bat has fur on its wings, but it has, yes, skin. And this skin is not just like, any old piece of skin. It's got a lot of like sensors on it. It can actually know where it is mechanically. Does all kinds of interesting things. The bat can make it taut when it needs to. It's not normal skin, but it is skin of the bat wing. What other things?
Use metacarpals for bird and
Yeah, so yep, the bird's hand is reduced and all fused up, that's for sure. How about that the bat's wing, the patagium of the bat's wing attaches down to the ankle? Does a bird's wing attach to its ankle? No, right? It's all up in the arms. You guys just saw a bunch of gliders. A lot of mammals. How are mammals gliding? They're attaching their stuff. So bats can fly, that's interesting, but they still have a patagium that goes from their ankle to their tail, from their ankle to their pinky, from their thumb to their shoulder, between all their fingers. That's pretty different. And it's really interesting to imagine, what does an early bat look like? Does it just look like another glider? One thing you might notice that's similar, that I think is beyond cool, is that the proportions of, and you can include the bird's feathers if you want, but you actually don't really have to. The proportions of the arm bones are really similar. Stout humeri, relatively, longer forearms, really big hands. Now, the bird's hand is not the same exactly in the skeletal system, but these feathers all attach to the hand. And so they all have big, this, kind of long versions of this and relatively reduced but well muscled this. So there is some like, this is analogous, right? This is how evolution is crafting the same kind of structures from in completely different ways, but still that structure is all still there, which I think is really cool. Yep, fun. Anything else? Bats and birds. Oh, I should have put that up there. The proportions, the structure of the airfoil, the structure of the support bit, where's the power coming from? Power coming from, we didn't talk about. You guys said it already, the birds have a huge sternum with humongous muscles for powering both up and down strokes of their wings. Bats are kind of like, they have good muscles on their shoulders and on their chest, but mammals are very different from birds. There's no giant bat muscles. There is no super powerful bat wing like there can be in birds. That is true. There's a lot of ways that comes out. You guys are looking at, these are to scale with each other. Both these people are to scale with each other. These are some of the largest flying birds that exist on this planet right now. And that's the absolute largest bat that exists. One species of bat that gets that big. And here's all the big birds. Talk to each other about these differences or not.
I didn't realize how big the looking for it.
Scary. All right, what's something we can say about the largest bat versus these birds?
Largest bat is smaller than like almost all.
There's only one species of the golden crowned flying fox, and it barely hits 5'6" or low 2 meters. A lot of raptors are the size of the largest bat. There's also a lot of different bird species that have independently evolved to be way bigger. And in the fossil record, there are tons of birds that are insanely bigger than this. There are no bats bigger than that. So one really interesting question in biology, comparative anatomy generally, is parts of the bird's skeleton. In particular, we didn't talk about it at all here, but this is the sternum. There's the scapula, just like you have. There's the clavicle, just like you have, the collarbone. That's what the bat has. Whereas the bird still has a scapula, and it's gonna be a wishbone. Its clavicle is gonna make a wishbone called a percula. Still has that big keeled sternum, but this is a coracoid. This is a bone in the shoulder girdle that all the reptiles have and birds absolutely have. Unlike bats, birds have a bony connection, a bony, hard, rigid, strong connection between their midline and their wing. The bat wing is like your arm. It's loose, it's muscular attachment. And so this is something that people talk about all the time and spend too much time talking about, but I think it's really interesting. Are bats like absolutely constrained to a certain size because of the skeletons mammals have, whereas birds, and all the birds that do it, including the fossil ones, have really big coracoids, have like just more physical structure in their wing skeleton. They can attach their big wings to their midline, so they can just get to sizes that bats can't get to. There's other things that birds do, of course, like their air-filled skeletons and their breathing that, maybe are other adaptations that let birds get bigger than bats. That's really cool. Pterodactyls are hilariously bigger than both of these, and it's a joke, but we're not gonna talk about them. What time is it? Oh, it's more done. Okay, so forget it. Well, I was gonna talk about aerodynamics. You don't need to hear that anyway. But look how this jet and this owl make the same vortices. Kind of fun. All right, have a great spring break, and I'll see you guys after.